John, I want to begin by reading you something you wrote last June as Labour headed towards a huge parliamentary majority. Keir Starmer's offer is change without disruption, an elusive notion that, for legions of discontented voters, means no change at all. Yet changes of a radical kind are coming. Starmer's promise of stability will return to haunt him, and fissures that are emerging in the monolithic party he has built will widen dangerously. Now, in the months since you wrote that piece, those fissures have deepened. Mm-hmm. Voters of all kinds of political stripes have turned against this government. What did you base that judgment you made last June on? What could you see that almost predicted our future, our present now even?
Two things, Will. I think one is that we're living in a time of, not of course historically unprecedented, but certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, instability in geopolitics. So geopolitically, the world is very different from what it was in the communist or the Soviet era, the Cold War era, and the immediately post-Cold War era. And it's tremendously, it could be known in June to be tremendously volatile, but also full of contradictions. The old ideologies of not only of communism and of classical liberalism, but of social democracy and one nation Toryism, all these kind of formula don't fit this world because it's not anticipated and has too many contradictions in it. So in order to even understand it, one has to have a very flexible turn of mind, a turn of mind that can understand that what seem like paradoxes, what seem like contradictions are truths expressed in the form of a contradiction, but they're reflecting the contradictory realities in the actual world. And one reason I thought that the promise of stability would not be kept and would probably break down quite quickly was that the Starmer and those who supported him in the party, who were then, I suppose, a majority,
yes,
thought that a kind of enhanced technocracy, that's to say something based on delivering to the population what it wanted, could be continued, could be made more competent, could be made acceptable, and would satisfy the needs of the voters. And I thought in a world of such enormous volatility and conflict, there was danger in any project which tied itself to formula, or still worse, which devolved powers of judgment to semi-independent institutions, which could then judge it to have failed.
So the OBR, for instance.
The OBR, that's the...
Which was something that Labour praised before they came into office, and now is something I think that there's increasing...
But it was very predictable, because you can't hold, in a world of the kind we live in, the worst kind of mind that approaches it is one in which there's a fetish of professional expertise combined with a processual reverence for rules and rights. That's the very worst.
You've talked about rights fundamentalism before.
Rights fundamentalism.
Yes.
I mean, the idea that this has to come first, that issues that much of the public regard as political issues can be depoliticized and handled by the courts or by some other agency, has always been a recipe for conflict later on. But this brings me to the second reason, is that which is a flaw in technocracy itself, which is it assumes a high level of consensus or convergence in the population on what are the goods of life that they want delivered to them, what are the key values, and that these key values won't conflict with one another. It assumes that that's true. But it's not true, because we actually have in Britain, less so than in America, which is much more deeply polarized over many issues, we have in Britain a wide variety of communities and strands of public opinion.
And values.
And values.
Yes.
And values. And they often conflict. So what happens when they conflict is then you have politics. But if you have someone committed to a kind of project which is in a sense almost a quiet euthanasia and an assisted death of politics as traditionally understood, be replaced by a tranquil process of administration backed up by the courts and the OBR. And it was almost as bad as that what they were promising. It could never have worked for long in any circumstance, but especially when the world economy is so unbalanced, especially when there are unresolved wars in which the major world powers are involved, but which stand aside from them to some extent or use them as proxy wars. So you don't have a world war, but you have a chronic state of war.
Yes.
And especially when within society there is so much cynicism and discontent about government, about politicians, which could have probably only been assuaged by an immense degree of competence. And from day one, there wasn't competence.
With this government.
Winter fuel and all the rest of it. They showed they weren't competent. But perhaps it never had a chance. That was my suspicion for the reasons I've suggested, which is that technocracy is very attractive in societies where the old political class is played out and doesn't really understand the world it lives in, wants to live in, as I think a lot of the people in the present government, at least at the top, do, not all but some. They really want to live in the 20th century, particularly the 90s. They don't like the world we now live in. Everything they do is framed on getting back to that lost world of prelapsarian world of confidence and harmony, and it wasn't like that. There were all sorts of things going on. Wars in the Middle East, wars in the Balkans.
Yes.
All sorts of things were going on, and it started to break down after all in a big way in the economy in the great financial crash, which has, I think, sunk deeply into the public consciousness, even of people who don't understand it, as an example of enormous elite incompetence. But the idea was you could renew this.
Well, the idea was you could be in the West Wing.
Yes.
And there have been people in every government that I've encountered as a journalist in, say, the last 5 to 10 years who have thought that they could sort of recreate the West Wing, and they held the West Wing up as an example of how politics should work. And I would often think...
How did they think it worked in the West Wing? No, it probably didn't work like that in the West Wing.
Obviously, the West Wing is fiction, so it doesn't work like that. No. But in the West Wing, smart young men and women, in their suits and ties and their blazers, they walk around corridors in the White House and the Pentagon or whatever, and they solve problems by talking very quickly and cleverly and wittily to each other.
But they also agree on what the main problems are.
Of course.
Which actually is not the case in the larger society. It wasn't even then it certainly wasn't a few months ago or a year or so ago in the run-up to the election.
But the self-image is of pragmatists, tough-minded pragmatists. And you've been quite interesting on Starmer. You've said he's ideological.
Yes.
In what way is he ideological? Because the self-image I have been told many times is that he just wants to make things work and get things done.
Well, ask what it is that he himself believes in when he looks in the mirror or goes to bed and sleeps, and what he thinks he believes. He believes in a world cleansed of radical conflict by law, by human rights. So I don't see him as a wholly an empty pragmatist who just want things that work. First of all, you need some conception, as I mentioned earlier, about the West Wing people. They have actually a rather clear conception of values. They're all pro-choice. I am actually, but it doesn't matter about that. They all have actually the same values, and they assume that pursuing those values and delivering whatever follows from those values will produce social peace. The problem is they bounce these problems and their solutions off each other, and in the wider world outside them, there is no such consensus.
Yes.
There's deep dissensus about the value of life, about euthanasia, about abortion, about what kind of families are important. Some people regard divorce as a tragedy, others as a type of liberation. And those divergences are not going to go away. And they're in particular not going to go away by imposing a program which involves the remodeling, the re-engineering of society on one particular cluster of values, which a certain slightly solipsistic group, which talks to itself in the West Wing or in Westminster all the time, has come up with. Let me give it maybe concretize it. I mean, even now you sometimes hear people say, elections in Britain are won from the centre. Which centre? Which centre?
Yeah.
I mean, this has been said so often by many people, including me, that I hesitate to repeat it. But the centre ground in the country is not the same as, and is in many ways completely incompatible with, the triangulated centre that emerges in Westminster.
Mm-hmm.
The centre has been different on issues not only of immigration and crime, but also on economics. It's actually, in some important respects, more left-wing, favouring public ownership of utilities and, for example.
A stronger state.
A stronger state.
Yeah.
A stronger state. Did not share the big society stuff of Cameron.
No. The 2017 Labour manifesto was very, very popular. Corbyn with that big state
That's
agenda.
another very important point, which is that Corbyn, although I strongly resist him myself, you have to take on board that his economic programme was very popular.
Corbyn won more votes in England in 2017 than Tony Blair did in 1997. And then what is the centre ground then?
Exactly. When people talk about the centre ground, when politicians and some commentators talk about the centre ground, they mean what they and their friends who have dinner with each other, who talk to each other in think tanks, regard as a sort of a triangulated compromise that they can live with. Mm-hmm. But that leaves out the fact that the common ground of large numbers of voters is quite different in important respects and incompatible with that.
I think what you're describing in that search for the centre ground, particularly since 2016, is really a kind of a sort of Don Quixote liberalism, which just keeps getting drubbed and beaten and shanked by its various political enemies. And one of the things you've always done, well, not always done for the New Statesman, but one of the things you've done for the New Statesman since 2016, I think, is chart various turns in that liberal centre, which is much smaller than it thinks it is. And so you've written about paranoid liberalism. Yeah. You've talked about hyper-liberalism. How would you describe the internal changes, these turns?
I'll just say what I meant by paranoid liberalism. I mean, I as it happened, I was in New York very close to the time when Trump, the announcement that Trump had won his first presidency came out. And I was, when you're in New York, you mostly, though I try to meet some non-liberals, you inevitably end up meeting mostly liberals because most of the intelligentsia and media people and so on there are liberals. And it was the first time in my life that I'd lived through a mass delusion. Because every single one of them, almost, or many of them anyways, it was the Russians.
Right, okay, yeah.
Now, the significance of that is it couldn't be something indigenous. The voters who voted for Trump in that first victory of Trump couldn't have been voting because of any deep-seated economic or other problems in the society, because there really weren't. Maybe the campaign wasn't quite what it should have been, Democratic, but anyway, that couldn't have been the reason. It couldn't be that they wanted something radically different and had long wanted something radically different. None of these were. It had to be the Russians. Now, the Russians probably did intervene, but it probably didn't make very much difference, actually, to what then happened. And he then, of course, in his second campaign, which many Democrats and many liberals and many progressives still didn't believe he would win again until it happened.
They deluded themselves all the way along. Yeah.
And that is actually a feature of our time, which I think is, and I've written a lot about it in the New Statesman, is very significant, which is the cognitive dissonance between what liberals think of the society in which they live, what it is, what values it's got, what it wants, and so on, and actually their perception of it. And so, except now, I think it's not. So they've got to come up with some explanation for why this unthinkable catastrophe, a Trump presidency, occurred in 2016. So say it's the Russians. In other words, it's exogenous to the whole.
It's an outside force which casts a spell on society. Yeah. It's not the China shock, or it's not. I mean, there were counties in that election where I think the more families in the county who had a relative who had died in Iraq or Afghanistan, those counties were more likely to vote for Trump. The China shock counties were more likely to vote for Trump.
They were.
These are failures of both actually Republicans and Democrats before 2016.
Well, it's hard to remember now, but Trump was regarded by many of his voters, and some still would like him to be this, as a peace candidate.
Well, yeah.
The forever wars. He
ran against Bush, in a way, in 2015.
And ran against the whole neoliberal, neoconservative establishment among the Democrats as well as the Republicans, who had launched these futile and meaningless and costly and disastrous and actually self-harming in many ways, American-led wars. So the point of saying it's cognitive dissonance is they look around for some way to reconcile the way they think of their performance and of their society, which can withstand the evidence that society is actually completely different.
Yes.
From the way they, in many fundamental respects, completely different. I think it's gone further now, though, because the script of history has departed even further much further than 2016. Although there are still many people who, including many in Europe, who say, well, all we've got to do, it's what they think or say to each other when they're consoling each other. All we've got to do is to hang on until Trump's gone and we'll get back on course.
Yes.
In other words, the whole Trump experiment, even though the second one isn't complete yet, and there have been two, not one, was it was an extraordinary, anomalous departure from the default direction of history.
Yes.
And so they're still clinging to that. Why are they clinging to that? Because if they give that up, their whole worldview disintegrates. It's more than the failure of a particular type of liberalism, more than the failure of certain political projects like Remain or whatever. Their whole worldview goes. But
John, this is, I think, maybe, let me play devil's advocate here. You know, I do know liberals, and they do read you, and you know they get annoyed by you, they get irritated. But I
might occasionally be the point.
Yeah, of course. But I think, what should they do? Do they abandon their worldview? Are you saying get tougher, get more realistic? Stop. You know, what would you say to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, for instance? You know, a couple of weeks ago, you know, the holes in Trump's peace plan and. You know, the peace plan in Gaza made disintegrate. And yet we do have a peace plan, and he did do it. And I think there was a certain kind of liberal who imagined that could never happen.
I don't want to inflict too much mental pain on them.
Right.
I don't. I think there are quite.
They're blowing in the wind, aren't they?
Yeah, but they're passing into history.
Do you think?
Yes.
What, like a European aristocracy in 1913 or something?
Yes. They're passing, or like not quite like that, because that was a much more violent process, but like the Russian Cadet Party, the Liberal Party, or the Social Democrats, or the Kerenskys, or even some of the Bolsheviks, actually. I mean, the world they lived in, that local world, vanished completely, and they had no place. Now, this is, in a sense, bigger than that, because it's the whole world. There's nowhere in the world, I think, where traditional social democracy can be revived. One can retain elements of the welfare state. One can continue to have an idea, a project of a cohesive society which contains a variety of groups, and they're held together by various shared values and so on. But the idea that the whole world, I mean, remember how the fall of communism was welcomed. It was said that Russia could become Sweden or Canada. It was completely absurd. But no one expected it, I think, or not many people expected it to become positively antagonistic to these Western ideas and these Western projects.
There were a few voices in the US system in the 90s who said that if NATO expanded eastwards, and these have been brought up a lot now in the context of the Ukraine war.
But that was a tactical or strategic argument. The argument was don't provoke them too much, because you
don't know what they might do. They won't like it.
Mearsheimer now, or and people earlier then. But I'm thinking of something much more fundamental, which is the belief that the default position of modernity is liberalism, or somewhat more radicalized version of that. That's turned out to be, I think, comprehensively falsified. But rather than following the advice of Karl Popper, which is to reconsider and drop theories and beliefs which don't square with events, what they do is what he called immunizing the theory. And so you immunize the view. I mean, how can that Trump couldn't win? He did win. So what do you say then? You immunize it by inventing, or exaggerating in this case, exogenous factors that brought about his win. And that's also still done. Whereas in reality, it's the internal conflicts and contradictions of advanced capitalist societies and the embrace by progressives of a set of values which they think all rational persons can and must adopt.
Yes.
And then attempting to impose those values on a population which at least has large sections of it do not share or actively reject those values. In America, over abortion, for example.
In this country, over immigration, I think.
Over
as well.
Immigration, yes.
And in America as well.
Or maybe in France over immigration.
Yeah, and Sweden and Germany and Spain. And,
we're not. We're not, actually.
Yeah,
we're not. It's almost ubiquitous as this point. You then provoke or create the very opposition to your progressive agenda that you didn't believe existed in the population at all, or at least I wouldn't say because it's there. You mobilize it.
Yes.
You mobilize that opposition against you. And that is what has happened everywhere. I mean, just a kind of way that it shows itself, it's basically a form of what the medievals called invincible ignorance. The way it shows it, people saying, do you think populism has peaked now? Do you think populism in America, do you think populism, well, peaked, if you ask that to a liberal, and most commentators are progressive liberals of one kind and another, it seems that they had nothing to do with it, that none of their own values, none of their policies, none of their programs had anything to do with it, or in no way complicit in the rise of populism. Whereas populism is a phenomenon which they have called into being. At least as in other words, what they've done is they've mobilized inchoate attitudes and values and sometimes well worked out beliefs about the world, which were scattered about in the population. They mobilized them into political movements by attempting to impose this progressive agenda on society, not even only in economics or foreign policy, but even in sport and how the words people use, the control of language and all that. They've done it. So they've created an opposition.
So it's a backlash. It is a backlash.
It's a
what
backlash.
We've seen in the last 15 or so years is
the answer is it will peak when and only when there has been an effective, competent, and enduring political response to this resistance, because what it is essentially a form of resistance. So it's meaningless to people. Is it peaking? People were saying it was peaking just before the last election in America.
Yes, and clearly it hasn't peaked. I mean, it
can't peak anywhere unless the underlying causes are addressed.
But let's think about on the last thing on the British Labour Party. Let's think about them in the context you've just spoken about, which is that there are people in the Labour Party who I think understand your analysis and probably actually agree with it in the most part.
Probably not many, and probably only a few.
One or two. There's some influential people in there, and they would sort of think, well, look, we took Labour back, we got rid of the Corbynites, we put the Union Jack on things, we tried to speak to people in a language that they would understand. And we're not woke, we're not hyper progressive, we're not hyper liberals anymore. Why hasn't that doesn't appear to have stopped reform having a very strong poll lead now for months after month after month. It certainly hasn't helped Labour with its own sort of parliamentary party, which I think Ralph Miliband always says was a big problem with Labour, was this parliamentary party. But that parliamentary party now doesn't like parts of the leadership. Yeah. This attempt to remodel Labour in an age of so-called populism, do you think it's failed? Well,
partly it's a consequence of unforced errors. So they began by a series of unforced errors, including, and still importantly, the winter fuel tax, which they needn't have committed and which dogged them to this day. But the fact that they committed them, probably as a result of Treasury advice,
it seems that way,
reveals their mentality. You turn to an expert. What does the economy need now? What do we have to do? Well, you could do this, this, and this. Now, more shrewd politicians, people who perhaps had more of a political sense of reality than they did, would have said, well, we can't do that, that, and that, including announcing there was a fuel cuts. This point, they would have vetoed it. But they went ahead because of their respect for rational authority and for procedure. They turned to the people who know about the economy, the Treasury. What they said was what they told them to do and what they did do in that case was disastrous.
Yes, politically disastrous.
Politically disastrous, and is something that permanently weakened them. It wasn't an error from which they could fully recover. So they have been weakened ever since. But the other thing, I guess, is, and it might seem, it's not common that I say this, but I think they should have learned something from the Corbyn project, which is, to go back to something we just said a moment ago, it did answer not only to my mind, some very toxic impulses, anti-Semitism and others, but it also answered to a feeling, a sense, well rooted in experience to a considerable extent, in what people now call lived experience, that this particular type of economy that we have doesn't work very well, and that it contains many injustices.
Yes.
It's not enough to come in and tidy it up and stabilize it.
Yeah.
What if you don't want to stabilize
You're
it?
cleaning a house that people don't want to live in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in America, the last thing people who voted for Trump wanted was the stability of the regime under which they were living. Mm-hmm. They wanted a different turn, a radically different term. And I think that's also true of people who voted Corbyn, who now may vote for the new party he's co-founded, and also for the Greens under the new leadership. So I think the approach which said we've dealt with Corbyn, he's out of the way, we can now stabilise the economy and therefore the political order. Therefore, was a fundamental error to the extent that it neglected what was wrong with the economy. I mean, even something like the Truss episode, I think has been misunderstood by the present government and by many on the left. It's easy to mock her, and she should be mocked.
In some senses, she is quite mockable.
It's very mockable.
Yes.
Very mockable. But it was an epiphany rather than a single mistake. What it revealed was the extreme fragility of our state structures, pensions, and on foreign capital. It revealed that actually after the 2008 crash, the major economic forces in the world, the merchant banks, the investment houses, the pension funds, had not learned the lesson of avoiding leverage and extreme risk. They'd gone on to develop more complicated, and even pensions were hedged around with all sorts of, not hedged in the sense of being protected against risk, but were having various complex derivatives which maximized it, because in a low interest rate world, it's very difficult to get a decent yield. So you can only do that by juicing up various financial instruments, and they did that. So what Truss revealed rather than caused was that fragility.
Yes.
And yet that was not at all taken on. I mean, the response, well, that was the Tories, that was Truss. But it's still there, and it may come back to haunt them.
Well, it was so interesting when, Tom,
will come back to
our editor Tom McTague interviewed Andy Burnham, and Andy Burnham said, I don't think, he had his reasons for saying this, and they were fleshed out. He said, I don't think we should be in hock to the bond markets.
We just are.
But then, of course, when this went out and it started going crazy and everyone was talking about should we be in hock to the bond markets or not, Andy Burnham thinks we shouldn't be. The bond markets then gave the government a bit of a whack.
Yes.
And it totally proved Burnham's point.
Yes.
We are in hock to the bond markets. Yes, that's what Truss revealed. So I suppose...
It's just a fundamental fact. Maybe we could have avoided it. It's a fact. I mean, more of our government debt is held by foreigners on a short-term basis than is true of most countries.
Yes.
So if they pull the rug, which they did under Truss, and they could do easily again, and did, as you say, in slightly premonitory way, kind of ticking them off and saying, just be careful.
It does feel a bit like that.
Yeah,
it feels like schoolboys getting whacked by a ruler.
Yeah. It almost happened, I suppose. It happened on the day that Reeve shed her tears.
Yes, yeah.
If she'd gone, it would have been much worse. She was protected by the fact that the bond markets recorded. I mean, they were exhibiting their power in that they kept her in position.
Yes.
But if she'd gone, it would have been much bigger.
But do we have a term for the political system we're currently living under? I mean, this doesn't sound. We're not describing anything conventional here. A constitutional monarchy,
well,
or
the reason
parliamentary democracy.
What social democracy? It tells you it is not and cannot be social democracy. In many ways, I'm an admirer of the old Labour settlement of 45 to post-war settlement, but of course it broke down in the 70s. Certainly can't be brought back now. But one of the reasons is that assumes a sovereignty over spending and taxing decisions, which actually no modern government, including, and this is the big one which has yet to happen, but symptoms of which can already be seen, in America. They haven't either. I mean, why are they sudden? Why did people flock to crypto and then there's a sudden crash? Why are people flocking to gold? And then one of the reasons is there's a very strong belief, which I think has got a lot of credibility, that under Trump, America will not deal with its debt because he loves debt, he said.
He said, I like to play with it, I think is what he said.
And secondly, maybe even can't now.
Yeah.
Because it's accumulating too rapidly and it would be too big of a shock. So what will then happen? If it can't be resolved by democratic politics, it will be resolved by markets forcing a big crisis on America. And that will mean that what happens later will be done against the background of a decision that was not democratically taken, but which was simply a result of market power. This has a sort of theoretical consequence, which is a lot of people have been talking about. We're living in the age of late capitalism, which suggests it's almost out of the window.
The time's going to run out on it. Yeah, on late capitalism. If it's late, then it's it's about to be over. Sure.
Yes, but that might not be true.
Yes.
Capitalism is morphing into different forms in China and Russia and now in America. They all have somewhat even in China, although Xi Jinping controls the plutocrats, they all involve huge levels of inequality. Mm-hmm. But it's still capitalism. And now if you're a traditional left-wing thinker, this is intolerable, you say we've got to get back to, or if you're even a left-wing, post-liberal left-wing communitarian, we've got to get back to reclaim this power. I think that's extraordinarily difficult to do. So the big changes that I foresee will come about from radical punctuations in history, not from evolution.
Yes.
Or incrementalism.
It's interesting to talk about sovereignty and thinking about the European Union as something that tried to pool its sovereignty. And if you go back 10 or 15 or probably about 20 years now, you'll find books which argue that what the EU has in the 21st century with its pooled sovereignty is an ability to be a kind of United States of Europe and be more successful.
But without an army.
They didn't
get around to that.
The army didn't, as we found out in Ukraine, it could do with
and the force de frappe in
But there was an idea there, wasn't there?
Yes.
And that hasn't happened either. I mean, Europe compared to even Russia or the United States, and certainly China.
One reason was that they started the wrong way round by having a currency before they had fiscal union, and fiscal union before they had a structure of Hobbesian power, a structure of defence. But another answer is that actually it was constructed, the EU, to preclude certain political projects, including social democracy.
Didn't Margaret Thatcher have a bit of a say in that as well?
No, I think
was that even before?
No, that was before. I mean, the idea
was
if you think of a continental-wide labour market, a continental-wide capital market, it's not possible for what used to be nation states or even regions to shut off certain types of economic transaction in the way that social democrats would do. You can't control. You can't say, you can't even have a national Keynesianism anymore. We're going to boost unemployment, and if that leads to certain problems, we're willing to accept it because unemployment is a great evil. So if it leads to inflation, we'll put up with a bit of inflation. You can't do any of that anymore. So that was another example of a project which seeded its own antagonisms and its own oppositional movements within it, because it was almost inevitable that left movements as well as right movements would rise against them. And now, of course, there are parties in Germany and elsewhere in Europe which are strongly against uncontrolled immigration, but also welfareist and pro-workerist. And, and there are right-wing parties which are, at least in their rhetoric, anti-capitalist as well. So I think the problem in this country has been that a certain poverty of thought. I mean, at least in continental Europe, there's a sort of wide variety of political projects which the EU tried to pacify in some kind of postmodern way. But they were there. In Britain, there's only been a kind of diffused Whiggism in all the parties, a diffused progressivism, with a few holdouts on the far right and the far left.
John, in the essay you've written for us this week, you turn to post-liberalism and some of the incoherence within post-liberalism. Can you take us back to the mid-1980s? You're at Jesus College, Oxford, and you're meeting the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. Now, he's just published this great sort of text of post-liberalism, which is called After Virtue.
Yes.
It's a famous assault on modern liberalism.
The seminal text.
The seminal text.
Of post-liberalism. There have been later ones, but that was it.
You and Alistair go for a walk, and you end up in Wadham College in the garden by the lovely trees.
Yeah.
And you sit down and you have a discussion with each other. What did you talk about that day?
We talked about... I asked him a lot of questions, which... we talked about what a society or a culture which was not corroded and hollowed out, as he believed Western liberal societies were, by individualism and subjectivism would look like. Because I wanted a an historical example, at least to be able to guide us. And I knew then that he had been a Marxist. So he had, at one point in the 50s and 60s, he had a clear idea of what were the deciding forces in liberal societies, which would be at least often primarily economic, although they'd also have obviously ideological repercussions. So I thought he would come up with something which he might say, well, there isn't an example. He didn't say that.
He had examples, didn't he?
He had examples.
And there are examples in that book as well, aren't there?
There are examples in the book, and there are examples he gave me. The examples in the book are monasteries at the start of the Dark Age and small Scottish fishing communities. He was, I think ultimately, originally from Scotland.
Yes.
And that's in the book, which I'd already read. And I'd been surprised and somewhat disappointed in the book that he came up only with these examples, because if you've been a Marxist, or for that matter, many types of liberal, you'll say, well, we live, and I think these are just facts, we live in a vast, complex industrial society with large populations and extensive technologies. How much can we learn about the nature of communities and of a good society from examples from such radically different parts of history when society was technologically simpler? And
well, I mean, even just the population of England in the medieval period compared to the population of England in the 1980s when you're speaking to us, these are very, very different societies, or they're on the far side of all kinds of things that make them very different.
But the example he gave me in our conversation was when he replied immediately. I said, well, give me an example of a society in which people are embedded in their culture and in their relations with each other in the way that you think is an alternative or a great improvement to that, in which we have to. He immediately said Rajasthan.
Rajasthan.
I
thought it was a current post-liberal society.
Well, I leant over to him. I thought, it can't be saying Rajasthan. I said, Rajasthan. He said, it's Rajasthan. So I think he did mean Rajasthan. And I found that puzzling.
Or unconvincing.
Completely unconvincing.
Yeah.
But I've almost Monty Pythonishly unconvincing. Because whether or not Rajasthan is really like that, I don't know. Neither did he, I suspect.
Has he been there?
No, I don't think so. But in any case, even if it was like that, that's to say that people were, there was a single form of life in which people knew their place, in which they were in deep relationships with each other. They weren't subject to anomie and complex anonymous institutions.
The cash nexus, as Carlyle called it.
Yeah. Carlyle called it.
Yeah.
They weren't subjected to any of that, as he imagined anyway. It was a wholly different society than had ever existed, or at least for centuries, in England. And I already thought what I later found corroborated in the work of the Cambridge anthropologist Alan Macfarlane, who wrote a book about the origins of English individualism, that England had never really been a society of immobile presence like that. Maybe Scotland had been a clan society and Ireland had, but England never had been. It had been a fluid, mobile, and actually rather strongly transactional society for a very, very long time.
It was somewhat individualistic.
Yes, it always
even
very
centuries ago,
and even very, very individualistic, and more than other countries had been. And there had been periods of collectivism post-war, the labour settlement, the kinds of working class communities and trade unions and working men's clubs that had grown up in parts of England, including my own native northeast. But there'd never been in Britain a society so to speak, organic or so seamless. There'd never been seamless communities of the kind which he thought exists.
Did you say this to him?
Later on, I did say that, and when we went for a walk, and he resisted and said, "No, there have been many. There are these." He always gave examples which I thought were rather marginal to the basic experience, the basic historical trajectory of modern societies, he'd say, no, there have been communities in many areas which have been destroyed by market forces, which of course is true. But I mean, in a sense, the insight of Marx is that the dynamism of modern capitalism does that.
Yeah.
And although I hadn't read Zygmunt Bauman at that time, I later came to think that what Bauman, the Marxian theorist, called liquid modernity,
Yes.
is, in a sense, a descriptive term as well as a theoretical one.
He did write for the New Statesman as well, Bauman, every now and then.
Yes, he did. He did.
Yeah.
That's perfectly true. I met him a few times, and later on, and he captured something very profound, which is, I think he put it at one point, did he not? That he said late capitalism is modernity realizing that it's unworkable, but not being able to
do much about it.
Or to put it in a different way, it was Gramsci, I think, who said morbid symptoms arise in late capitalism, which don't point to any immediate solution, so you get into a kind of stasis. I think, by the way, just incidentally, that all this talk of late capitalism might be rather premature.
Yes, of
because
course.
what's happening in the broader world is not that capitalism, in most of the world, is being replaced by any other type of economic system, but that it's morphing or mutating into different, some would say, slightly malevolent or morbid forms as state capitalism, oligarchical capitalism,
crypto capitalism, whatever
all
that
sorts
is.
of semi-anarchical capitalism. But capitalism. So it may be a long time before capitalism, which is anything that can be described as actually its late phase. But my main objection was to him on this. That was the first main objection. My first was that this was a remote and incredible and possibly not even accurate example in the case of Rajasthan. But in the case of the other ones, they were not really germane to the problems of to a political project, which would, if one is possible, which could cope with these pathologies, the pathologies of individualism in modern society, which are at least partly real, although what has actually transpired is not the horror that he anticipated of a completely rootless, depersonalized, as they used to call it, atomized society. That's not what's happened.
I want to get to where I think I know where you're going, but there's one last thing I want to say about McIntyre quickly, which is that often when we talk about, or you read about post-liberalism in an almost textbook way, you're grouped with McIntyre. And I think it ignores something quite important about your work and your political writing for the New Statesman, which is that there is a line in your writing where you will say this about any kind of political project, doesn't matter whether it's liberal or post-liberal or communist or whatever. The past cannot actually be recovered. You are not a nostalgic person. No. You're not trying to recreate the world of your youth.
Not even when I thought it was better.
Yeah, exactly. But you have an awareness that you do not think the clock can be turned back, and so.
It's often not desirable to turn it back either. But even if it was desirable, the world in which labour collectivism of the kind that actually paradoxically created the society that Margaret Thatcher wanted to return to, the deferential, stable, cohesive society of the 50s, was a creation of the labour collectivist project for as long as it lasted, until it ran out of steam, actually not when Thatcher came to power, but before that, under Dennis Healey, because that was when, in quotes, Thatcherite economic policies, abandoning the post-war settlement, abandoning Keynesian, that's when it happened. 76, not 79 or 1780. So even if something has been benign in many ways, which I think the post-war labour settlement was, I've always, as you rightly say, Will, in my writings in New Statesman over 30 years, I've always cautioned against the political impulse to to implement a model of the future based on the past.
Yes.
Our primary duty as human beings, thinking beings, and certainly as political actors, is to understand the present, to use a phrase from the American poet Wallace Stevens, because he says, it's the present that's uncharted. The future's easy. You make it up. It never comes about, actually, the way you want it to, but you can make it up. And I think that is true now. If you do that, of course, you'll be criticized for being excessively realistic, for limiting the scope of human imagination and political possibilities. And to some extent, that's a legitimate criticism, because a lot of things that people think are possible turn out not to be. But then I think you've got to try and decide what can be done to mitigate recurring political evils, recurring human problems. And things can be done from time to time,
yes,
as they were after the Second World War in Britain. But do remember, and I benefited from this myself, that was not an incremental change. What happened in 1945 in the US was as a result of a revolutionary upheaval, a world war.
Yeah, and a fairly revolutionary sentiment in Britain itself.
In Britain itself, certainly by the end of the war.
By the end of the war, the war leader is kicked out, and a pretty radical government is put in. Because the people, there was a sentiment. If you read high Tories, if you read Evelyn Waugh's take on,
they hated it.
they understood something.
Or if you read the jokes of the time, the Duchess in Dorchester saying, "The country won't stand for this."
Yeah, exactly.
she won't.
No, exactly.
But she had to. She had to just.
But they knew their world was about to be eclipsed. Now, there's one more.
But the Liberals now, interestingly, don't know that yet, because nearly all of them think that a reversion to what they understand as the default mode of modern history, that of the 1990s,
will come back.
Or can be made to come back. And I think that's what the Starmer government did. I think, by the way, the American Democrats, partly from the scale and of their defeat, the reason they've not come up with anything except a few personal attacks from Newsom on Trump and so they've come up with, it's the scale of the epistemic shock.
Yes,
he won all that he could win. It wasn't perhaps a landslide but all the institutions have been taken, and even if some are lost in the midterms. By the way, everyone says if they're lost in the midterms, the pendulum will swing. That's assuming Trump accepts that they've been lost, and that it wasn't another,
that's the thing.
Another hook. If he doesn't, then that's a real regime change.
Yes. We may be seeing.
Quite soon. We might be in the early phases of it now, a real radical regime change. I mean, I did write that in the New Statesman, that I thought this is what would happen.
There are not, it's not uncommon if you go over there and you speak to people involved in MAGA now, it's not uncommon to meet people who would be quite happy to not have another election in the United States.
Yes.
And I don't mean that, I just mean that in as flatly as possible. I'm not judging that, I'm not being hysterical about it, but that is not uncommon.
Yes.
And I do know some people in the Foreign Office and others who've discussed this, but it's not really widely understood that we might be, as you say, this might be an actual break.
Yes.
An actual regime change.
A radical historical discontinuity.
Yes. Yes.
Because even the policy of European security is based on the notion either that Trump will in the end come round and back European defence, though he's said countless occasions that we have to pay for it, and that we and he's on several occasions walked away from Europe and come back. It's either based on the idea that he will come back, which I don't think he will, and his interests are elsewhere. Maybe Monroe Doctrine-like things in Venezuela, but that's about it. It's not even clear that he wants a major confrontation with China, or they think that once he's gone, we'll be back on the historical default mode of the trajectory of history.
Yes.
I think it's much more likely and imaginable that when he's gone, either when his presidency ends in the normal, or maybe before then for health or other reasons, what we will have is more radical populism, J.D. Vance or someone else.
It carries it even further.
Well, much of the party, much of the MAGA movement, I would say much now, not just parts, much of the MAGA movement regards Trump as having copped out on a number of things, not only on Epstein files and so on, but even on his economic program. And he was going to be much more radical on defending workers' interests and so on than he's proved to be. And that is, in other words, much less of a radical nationalist than he represented himself as being. So I think it's more likely, or at least certainly better, to prepare for a world in which that happens than one in which there is this reversion, which has actually not happened anywhere. Really. I mean, where is there in Europe the social democrats have returned to power in a number of countries, but only by doing something actually really effective on immigration?
Yes, the Danish example.
Well,
I have to ask the question. I have to ask the question that you asked Alistair, and which I think a lot of your essay for us this week is about, which is if it's not a sort of a world of crofters in Alistair's sort of fishermen and crofters,
and monasteries,
you have an idea of what, and you've written about this before, but you've really written about it this week, of what this world looks like, and it begins with your view, which I think is let's call it mildly controversial, that Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan, was a liberal.
Yeah,
there's a paradox there, I think. Could you just talk a little bit about Hobbes?
It's controversial for lots of people, but particularly for post-liberals, because they all hate Hobbes.
Yes.
He's the real demon for them because they represent Hobbes as a radical individualist, which in some senses he was, as seeing society as an aggregate of individuals. Don't quite go that far. But also because he sees, he was adamantly opposed to the classical philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, and also actually set himself apart from any Christian theological defense of political order through divine right. He didn't believe in any of those things. But that's actually why he isn't a liberal, because one of the reasons he is a liberal, because a liberal, I take it, regards the political order or political authority as being conditional upon their consent, it performing the tasks which it should perform or which it's promised to perform. And when it doesn't, it can be removed. You can execute the king. So in that sense, he's certainly a liberal compared with medieval political thinkers or ancient Greek and Roman political thinkers. But he's also, I think, a liberal in a more interesting sense because he's trying to envision a form of political order that doesn't depend upon deep convergence of values.
Yes.
This is why it's timely now.
And this is something you wrote in Post-Liberalism, Studies in Political Thought in 1993. You argued that contending projects for the political protection of cultural identity, each of which seeks privileges and entitlements which cannot, in their nature, be extended to all. You said this was a new Hobbesian dilemma.
The new Hobbesian dilemma, as I think of it, is when in liberal or hyperliberal or post-liberal societies, identity groups become the theatre of political conflict. So there's a demand for identity, which is to say people don't only want to be a subject of a ruler or even a citizen of a state. They also want to be part of what they call communities, although a lot of them are quite recent and have no historical roots. They're sort of invented or self-defined.
Yes.
And the problem about that, of putting that at the centre of politics, that type of identity-based communalism, is partly that it does leave some people out. I mean, if you're like perhaps the majority of the population of all different religions and ethnicities, and you're not deeply embedded in any of them, where do you fit in this? I mean, where do your freedoms of exit, your freedoms of speech, your freedoms to be...
No, they're constrained, aren't they, by these identities?
By other communities or by the one you're supposed to be in. So I thought back in the early 90s that the end of the road for this would be a fragmented society rather than an atomized society. Not all these anomic individuals floating about, as it were, uprooted and rootless, but of people wanting to join communities, creating communities which could take the form of political movements. They could take the form of now of internet-enabled groups of various kinds, and fighting other groups for power and resources, but also for a kind of therapy, because there's no doubt that, I mean, one aspect of McIntyre's argument, which he shared with the sociologist Durkheim, is that anomie is a problem in modern societies, that people are not just isolated, but they don't know what their norms are or should be. So they form communities. They define those communities. They define them partly by exclusion of other groups. And it's between those communities that political contestation then happens. And I think that's rather unfortunate, because what I might sound even a bit nostalgic myself when I say this, but I think what many people say, those post-liberals who regret the rise of identity politics and so on, say is well, we used to be in a situation where we could rub along together, where we didn't have deep communal relations with our immediate neighbours necessarily, or with large numbers of people. We could have them with groups that we joined or churches that we belonged to. But by and large, we simply rubbed together. And we did not necessarily have the same values or conceptions of the good life, but we managed to rub along together. Mm-hmm. And it's that modus vivendi liberalism, as it's sometimes called, that I find in Hobbes and which is relevant, I think, to us now. And what's wrong with an aspect of post-liberalism is the desire to really recreate a moral or cultural solidarity that I don't think ever existed. I mean, as anybody would knows a bit about late medieval Europe, which is the world in early modern Europe that Hobbes emerged from. It was a time of great religious wars.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So there hasn't ever been...
Millions died in Europe.
And millions died.
Yeah.
There hasn't ever been, actually, even in the West, even in the liberal West, what then became the liberal West, there's never been a kind of an organic, seamless type of society there. And of course, the danger of all such societies, or the project of creating or recreating such societies, is that they almost always target minorities as the malevolent elements that are preventing the society from being harmonious.
Yes, which is the kind of toxic strain in...
That's the toxic strain.
In post-liberalism, yeah.
It's come out on the progressive left.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism, but also in the in the MAGA movement. And I think that's a very, as you say, kind of toxic development. But why is he a liberal? So, I mean, by the way, the view that Hobbes was a liberal, or even the first liberal, is not controversial among intellectual historians. Including
I suppose the controversy maybe comes in the essay where, in order, your diagnosis of Britain now is I think you would argue that those contending projects for the political protection of cultural identity is the Britain we sort of live in today.
I think it is. Yes.
And so, in order to restore individualism, or to allow
a type of individualism,
based
on human vulnerability, the fear we have of others, and the danger of a slide into anarchical situation.
Yes,
that type of individualism.
Yes, but then that requires the Hobbesian state. So that's
my thesis.
To save liberalism,
yes,
requires a kind of
a strong state.
Yes, a very strong authority,
and a relatively unfettered state of the kind we had up to a decade or so ago. Because until a decade or so, and certainly in the time of Margaret Thatcher, we had unfettered parliamentary sovereignty. Now, as everyone says, it wasn't really unfettered because there were all kinds of conventional and other limitations, restraints, constraints on it. And it wasn't even unwritten, wasn't it? Because thousands and thousands of pages of case law and precedent had been written in notebooks of parliamentary procedure and so on. But what was distinctive about it was parliamentary sovereignty. Not the division of and separation of powers as in the United States. And it was this, I think, the virtue of that was that it allowed radical changes in the ruling settlement without violence and without civil war, except in the 17th century, because there was no sharp division between law and politics. It was an essentially political constitution. That, I think, was one of its great virtues. Now, whether we can actually get back to that, as I hope we still might, is another question, and an even deeper question. I mean, if someone were to ask me what's the strongest criticism of the view you're now presenting, I would say it is that maybe the political class isn't up to operating this.
Well, that's the fear, isn't it? The fear is that
operating an unfettered parliament. When they've decided things among themselves, they've often made disastrous errors.
Yes, and I think in the essay you do touch on. There's been some moves such as the proscription of Palestine action. There've been some attempts to kind of
and other groups
and other groups,
white supremacist groups.
There's been attempts to sort of buttress
and Russian groups,
attempts to buttress the authority of the state. But I don't get the sense that you think the Starmer project is going to be that Hobbesian project. And then you go into reform, and you have your doubts about.
I do. Well, on the Starmer project, the chief reason I don't think the Starmer project can work is it doesn't really understand where populism came from.
Yes.
So their answer is, well, we must maintain the rule of law, rigorously punish incitement to violence, which I agree with. Any Hobbesian has to agree with that. It's obviously any sensible person has to agree with it. But if you then say what we need is a surveillance state, what we need is extensive censorship to prevent people expressing views that might be considered by some member of society to be offensively racist or not. I think you risk or even almost inevitably provoke or mobilize the forces that you're afraid of, because you're bringing into, you're challenging, you're curtailing, you're restricting. What until even in the living memory of relatively young people were freedoms they enjoyed before.
Well, the interpretation of these events where people get arrested for tweets, or certain groups, their protests end in mass arrests.
Yes,
it's interesting how they play into your diagnosis of Britain, which is that these different groups then get sort of quite angry about these different attempts to curb their speech. Whereas I think the Chinese government would just say, well, nobody gets to speak freely, and then you don't have these great gusts of emotion.
Yes.
Blowing through the system and these different groups fighting with each other.
But we're not an autocracy of that kind. And that too has made gigantic errors.
Of course,
COVID. We're not, see, I think is, given our historical trajectory and the fact that we did once have a parliamentary sovereignty, under which, by the way, here's a different example. I would say that under Labour, even in 1945, or Wilson, or most of our history up till a few years ago, when we did have an unfettered parliament which hadn't incorporated European law into domestic British law, free speech was more secure, less curtailed than it is now. Who could, with a straight face, claim that free speech is safer now in Britain than it was 20 years ago? It's vastly more curtailed. Now, you may take the view it's rightly more curtailed, but it's curtailed. I don't think that's the case. But I'm
not sure it is more curtailed. I think maybe there are attempts by the state to curtail it. But when I read, for instance, I was reading this morning about this big rumor on TikTok, which is that you can catch sexually transmitted diseases from ladybirds. Now, people seem to in Britain believe this because they saw it on their phone.
Yeah.
That's a kind of speech that just floats around these systems. There's stuff like that all the time.
But there have been hundreds and even thousands of arrests of people for tweets.
It's true. And I think that's definitely...
that has occurred. But it's not clear that the regime of rights, and I think it's in fact clear that the regime of rights we incorporated at that time has not prevented these incursions of free speech, of people being hauled away in handcuffs or visited by the police and told that their thinking should be checked and so on. None of that has been prevented by the regime of rights. Before that occurred, they were largely inconceivable.
What happens if... I think the thing that you and Hobbes both want, which is commodious living. What happens if that cannot be established?
Then you have ungovernability or tyranny.
Do you fear those outcomes?
I fear ungovernability.
Yes.
I doubt that we're not as polarized as America is.
No.
I don't think there'll be a civil war in America, but I can easily imagine that as a realistic possibility, that if Trump takes the regime change further and attempts to ignore the results, say the midterm elections, or say they were all hoaxes or whatever, and carries on as if they didn't happen, or begins to impose greater repressive force then I can easily imagine a kind of low-level, low-intensity, violent civil disorder in America. In France, which has a tradition, if you like, of regime change, I can imagine realistically, from a mixture of political incompetence and paralysis and fiscal issues that prevent the government dealing with its enormous fiscal overstretch. I can easily imagine a situation in which, not easily perhaps, but I can imagine a realistic situation in which there's violence in the streets, which ends up on a large scale ends up with even a new republic. I don't think it's at all. In the British case, I think the danger is more just ungovernability. We won't have a perilous period of military dictatorship and so on. But in other respects, we could just slide into a situation in which ideological, political, or ethnic murder is normalized, in which people watch what they say. because they think they can be physically attacked or killed, not just cancelled or excluded, in which no government is trusted really to implement or deliver any policies. In other words,
I think that's
close.
If there's a lot of polling that sees, I mean, trust in these institutions may be one of the defining.
Very low. But I can imagine going further into that and that becoming a semi-permanent condition, because let me put it a slightly different way. One of the more heterodox literary projects I've had while writing for the New Statesman is to revalorize the concept of decline. Because decline is used nowadays almost always in a pedagogic way, which means if we can recognize these symptoms or signs of decline, we will reverse them.
Yes.
That's not always possible. It's part of my resistance to nostalgism. It doesn't mean you have to be a complete fatalist. You can do some things. You can tilt the baton of the events in one way or another. If you, remember, there's never any a universal you or a universal we, but if you and the people who think like you are well enough positioned. But the idea that by recognizing decline, you can reverse it is just a modern fantasy. The ancient Greeks didn't think like that. Shakespeare didn't write his tragedies because he thought like that. Nobody thought like that.
Well, there wasn't a way out for Hamlet. It was going in one direction, wasn't it?
Well, even Macbeth, I think, which has
a better example.
A tacit political philosophy, because he thought basically his fate was tragic because he trusted the words. He trusted the words that the witches put.
He shouldn't have done that.
No, he shouldn't. Well, we shouldn't do it either when we talk about rights, freedom, all these grandiose, and historically they almost always go with, or very often go with large casualties. If you rely on them as realities, you're going to have disaster. So I think the reality, and this is a Hobbesian point, I think, in the modern world. In the 20th century, it's true that the worst crimes, the worst atrocities, the worst, let's just call them human evils, were very largely the result of overextended states. The Nazis, the communists, totalitarian powers. In the 20th century, it's, I think, more common for them to be by the breakdown of state power.
Oh, in Rwanda, yes.
In Rwanda, the breakdown of state power. The anarchical breakdown of state power is more is I think emerging as a great evil. The trick, if you like, which we may not be able to pull off, is to have a Hobbesian state that keeps us out of this state of nature, keeps us out of this war of all against all, without being completely invasive, which it is in China. I mean, China's a big place, so if you live on the Tibetan plateau and wander about as a non-Kama,
you might be okay.
You might be all right because they can't police it all. But if you live in any large settlement or city,
well, we saw during COVID what
they could do,
what the state there is capable of. Yeah.
Can a Hobbesian state be reinvented in a form that leaves a wide margin to human beings of different religions, different faiths, different worldviews, different interests, different values, to coexist to their mutual benefit and live commodiously without being forced into a straitjacket of deep surveillance and constant haranguing. See, I think what defeats the Starmer project is that the security state has been conflated with the progressive state. It's not only that they want to rightly mitigate or eliminate serious threats to public order and peace and attacks on minorities, on immigrants and others.
But it feels as if it's actually been politicized.
Well, not just politicized.
I mean, they would push back so strongly against that. They would say that these laws aren't, I mean, I suppose it depends who you're speaking to, but I think the police, there were parts of the senior police leadership were very frustrated by this.
Yes.
And they just say they're kind of following it by the book. It's not really a political thing.
Well, I think one of the problems about the police force is that they fear, quite rightly, that if they make decisions of their own which deviate too much from what seems to be the rule book now, they'll carry the can and they'll be sold down the river.
Yes.
So they do whatever. So I don't blame the police, actually. I think the problem is further up, maybe with the leadership of the police, but beyond that with the politicians, because the politicians haven't got a clear vision. There's a difference between a Hobbesian state which accepts the jumble of different faiths, different religions, different philosophies, different interests in life, different forms of family life, accepts that as fact and also as potentially beneficial. And one which says, a lot of this is sheer bigotry or prejudice or atavistic remnants of the past. We're going to get rid of them. We're going to create a progressive population. And that's something that the Starmer government is also closely associated with. And that's
in the minds of the public. Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
There are things that have happened. I mean, I don't know how much this has sunk in to the public, but I think the public started by being in favour, as I was, and I'm still, if it could ever be done reasonably, in favour of voluntary euthanasia.
Yes.
There's been a shift since then, because what it seems to be is that it's first the legal controls have been watered down. Now you're going to have some unspecified body of experts. Do I want my life to be valued by some expert? Who will that be?
Yes.
Somebody with some crackpot-like theories of, or a utilitarian who tries to tot up my utiles of that of my family.
It's a very long.
It's monstrous. But also, I'm a supporter of choice rather than choice in abortion. But when it's extended to the moment of birth, as it would otherwise,
it becomes something slightly different.
No, very different. I think it becomes infanticide. So I think there is a side to the Starmer administration which could be represented as a kind of hard centrist Hobbesianism, but it's side by side with a progressive impulse which wants to impose what are currently thought of as the most enlightened values, and these two things are not compatible either politically or philosophically.
I want to go back to something. I was reading through your back catalogue yesterday evening, which was a very, very pleasant way to spend the evening. I want to go back to something you wrote in 2013. Quote, "Power is leaking away from the West, and no assertion of the superiority of Western systems of government will stem the flow." And I thought, yeah, that was right. And I suppose I just want to end by thinking about Britain. Are we just describing something that's happening in all countries across the West? The power is leaking away from them, and then internally that creates all sorts of malign issues.
Pan-Western phenomenon.
Yeah,
at its most acute in the United States, because partly recent history told Americans that they had brought about the end of history. It told them that they were the sole superpower. It told them that they'd achieved what the rest of the world had failed to achieve, but which could be universalized throughout the rest of the world. But also even in Britain, we have a slightly different response because we're well-schooled in decline. We've had generations of it. We're not a world power anymore. We're not an imperial power. We're not even the kind of model of semi-laissez-faire pluralism that we thought we were in the 60s and 70s. That's all gone. We realize we're in an acutely troubled power, heavily dependent on forces we cannot control, with an internal population which, although not as polarized as America, is deeply fractured. So, and yet, on the other hand, the countries that are emerging as definitive of the next period of history are China and India and the Gulf states.
Yes.
Among others, and parts of Africa, maybe not yet, but probably that will happen. They're outside of what we now think of as the West. And I think this is a profound civilizational challenge. And I may differ actually from some of post-liberals that I know on this, which is they think the West can still reassert a kind of global leadership. What I take as the more modest view, which is that what was good in our way of life, we should try to preserve and bring back, or extend and even improve if that's at all possible, but without having a universalist impulse. That's to say, without it basically, which is just a joke in the rest of the rest of the world now. If you go to Africa and say you should live like us, you'll be highly beneficial if you do, and we are going to give you the following lecture tapes to watch. They only take a few hundred hours. I'm sure you'll find them deeply absorbing.
Well, I think Afghanistan's the great example of this.
I think Afghanistan was we were there 20 years after all. And what emerged was we didn't know, we include the Americans, NATO, American-led force, didn't know what we were doing there. Was it projecting a Western image of what a society should be on Afghanistan, which was not a nation state. It had a monarchy, but in periods of its history, but it was not a Western nation state. It was in many ways still a clan state with elements of modern life had grown up. And then it suffered this defeat at the hands of the Taliban, which, again, if you go back, was, of course, partly seeded by Western support for jihadism in the war with the
in the 80s,
in the 80s and so on. But we didn't know what we were actually doing. Was it an anti-terrorist operation? Was it simply to the terrorists didn't actually come from Afghanistan, actually. They came from Pakistan or other countries. So, no, we didn't know what we were doing there. And I think this is, for America particularly, it'll be a profound psychic trauma to realize that the laws of history are inexorable. Decline is real. But it doesn't mean you can't live well. It just means you abandon your hubristic illusions about being in control of history. You may be able to protect, and I still think it is possible to protect, and I say to improve and even extend the perhaps slightly old-fashioned liberal values of free speech and toleration and mutual forbearance and so on, that we did have, however imperfectly, for a period of time. But not in a sense, they have to be reinvented and reimagined. And they were part of, if you like, of a common culture in Britain. I think now, if free speech is to be restored, that does require some kind of legal action of the kind that the last government, even the present government, actually say they're going to apply to universities, but haven't really done so.
Yeah.
So it is a kind of a Hobbesian solution. But I mean, many people find this a very unwelcome, not just message.
I think they find it tough. I think they find it. They think
some of the post-liberals do, but also some of the Enlightenment liberals, because they say,
yeah. But then what do I do? I think people often. I think they probably accept a lot of your argument intellectually, but then they think personally, because we are all individuals, aren't we? And we think, oh, well, what should I do about that? I think that's where they.
Well, you find a lot of. I mean, I leave that open to the reader.
Well, you've written a whole book about feline philosophy, which actually has some answers to that question, which I do recommend to listeners.
So, well, I hope they read. I mean, I think we can learn an awful lot from cats.
Well, a kind of cat-like stoicism,
or a cat-like. A cat-like pragmatism as well.
Yes, yeah.
Adjusting your. I mean, one of the things in the feline philosophy said, cats are not foolish enough to think that you can persuade people to be reasonable by giving them rational arguments. If they're not reasonable, but you might still try to live on good terms with the rest of your society. You might still want to change it in important respects, and then you should. If you really want to do that, you should band together with others and try and do it. But they need to be respects which are, in fact, achievable. And what I think is dangerous, not only delusional, but dangerous, is the idea that the rest of humankind, including the non-West in its many diverse forms, there isn't the non-West as a separate entity. There are countless different cultures, traditions, and ways of life that, although interacting with the West and interpenetrating with the West, even including elements of Christianity. Christianity has huge non-Western traditions in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe and elsewhere, Egypt, and so on. The great illusion is to think that all other human beings want what you want.
Yes.
And then you transfer that to your own society and you say, at bottom, unless they're irrational, of course, unless they're bigots, unless they're whipped up by demagogues, they all want what I want. Well, they don't. There's a huge degree of diversity even in our society. So the beginning of wisdom there is to accept that and then say, well, what can we then do? And then what you think is important, conservation of animals, wilderness, I contribute to some charitable causes for that, specifically political groups that defending particular minorities or groups that are occluded or reviving the arts or promoting beauty in urban spaces, whatever it is, do that. Now, the obvious criticism would be, does this amount to a political project? Well, I think the big thing that has to be said is there's no universal political project. This is, I think, one reason why people now get so discouraged. What they want is a successor to Marxism, to liberalism, to the Enlightenment project. That's universal.
Yes.
This is what people in Nigeria, people in China, people in Tokyo, people in all over the world, they should all agree. That's not going to happen.
Yes.
There isn't. There are global problems. There are global problems. But except on a narrow, even when they're genuine problems, like climate change, which I'm not a skeptic about, it's real, perhaps even more rapidly developing than we think, because it's not a linear development, it kind of jumps.
Yes.
It may be more, but there isn't actually a global solution because there's no global authoritative and there isn't going to be